1936, and France is having an election. So French politics at this point can largely be described as a dumpster fire. They were divisive, violent, and ruling was extremely difficult. This election was won by a left-wing coalition called the Popular Front, with a man called Léon Blum taking over as Prime Minister. Side note, France did have a president at this point, but he wasn't important. Anyway, with the elections behind them and a clear mandate, you'd think that governing France would be less difficult. But fun fact, no. The government needed to sort out the economy because Great Depression, which was made more difficult when large-scale strikes broke out across the country. These were settled with what were called the Matignon Agreements, which saw the introduction of a 40-hour work week as well as better paying conditions. Blum's government also had to deal with the right-wing paramilitary league, Le Croix de Feu, the Cross of Fire, led by army veteran François de la Roque. The government came up with a subtle way of doing this. They banned them. This didn't stop conservatives in France from fearing the worst though. In fact, many believed that the victory of the Popular Front with its communist support heralded the coming of a communist revolution in France with the support of the USSR. These fears were misplaced though, and the Popular Front would suffer from the same instability and infighting that the previous coalitions had dealt with. Blum resigned in 1937 and was replaced by Camille Chanton, who frankly didn't do much. His government collapsed in early 1938 and thus Blum returned, for less than a month. Blum was replaced by Edouard Daladier in April, and Daladier's government was focused not on France's internal problems, but instead upon Germany, which had recently annexed Austria, which it wasn't supposed to do. This was followed up by Germany's leader, a certain Adolf Hitler, from demanding this area, the Sudetenland, from France's staunch ally Czechoslovakia. This resulted in the Munich Conference, whereby France and Britain agreed that Germany would be allowed to annex the Sudetenland. Czechoslovakia itself wasn't invited to this meeting because they'd only do things like disagree. It should be noted that very few in France were willing to tolerate the idea of war at this point. Both sides of the political spectrum were filled with pacifists who believed that the costs of war, as demonstrated by the devastation of the First World War, were never worth it. France was very proud of the Munich Agreement and saw it as a great victory, and Daladier's popularity soared, until Hitler conquered the rest of Czechoslovakia, that is. France's appeasement of Hitler's territorial ambitions could only go so far. Germany invaded Poland on September 1st, 1939, and 2 days later France declared war on Germany alongside Britain. What followed was not an intense push into Germany, but what the French called the Drôle de Guerre, or as it's known in English, the Phoney War. This was basically when neither side did much except clash at sea because the French did not wish to push into Germany and Germany could not push into France. The reason for this was the extremely potent line of fortifications called the Maginot Line. This wasn't designed to be impenetrable but was supposed to force Germany to go around through Luxembourg and Belgium because better to fight a war there than at home. Daladier now saw the Communist Party as a potential threat because the USSR had signed a non-aggression pact with the Third Reich, the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. This led to many communists being arrested and forced into exile. There was still a sizable movement of people who wanted peace, it's just that early on patriotism ran high. This lasted until Franco-British relations hit a few snags. This was because the British botched the defence of Norway, which soon fell to the Germans. The failures here led to Daladier being ousted and replaced by a man called Paul Reynaud. The Phoney War came to an end in May of 1940 when Germany, as the Maginot Line dictated, pushed through Belgium to advance into France. They also took the Netherlands because why not? Long story short, the German army pushed their tanks through a heavily forested area which wasn't accounted for. They then came into contact with some poorly trained French recruits, broke through and then pushed a wedge between the French forces to the south and the Franco-British forces to the north. The British retreated to Dunkirk, where they then bravely ran away as French troops fought to cover their retreat in what was extremely brutal and bloody fighting. The British now believed that France was doomed to fall and so refused to commit resources to a defence which deeply strained the alliance. France began to collapse at this point, which was hastened by Italy joining the war against them too. On the 14th of June, Paris was captured and Reynaud, after refusing to hold peace talks, resigned on the 16th. This was after people in both the French and British governments proposed a radical plan to keep France fighting, the Franco-British Union. This was where both nations would be merged into one under a single government and military command. Whilst Reynaud and Churchill were strong supporters of the move, it was rejected by other French ministers because to many of them they were simply being asked to choose between domination by the Germans or by the British. After Reynaud was gone, it was his deputy and one of the main proponents of an armistice who took over for him, a certain Philippe Pétain. On the 22nd of June at Compiègne, the same place Germany signed its armistice at the end of World War I, France agreed to peace on Germany's terms. These were that 1. France would be divided into 2 zones, an occupied zone in the north which the French would pay for and a free zone in the south. 2. The French fleet would stay in their home ports but the Germans would leave them alone. 3. The French army was limited to 100,000 men, and 4. All French prisoners would remain in captivity until Britain made peace. Britain did not believe that condition number 2 would be honoured and so sent an ultimatum to the French: hand over your ships docked in North Africa over to us, or else. The French said no because they'd agreed not to in the armistice, and so the Royal Navy attacked, killing over 1,000 1,000 French sailors and crippling the fleet there. To put it mildly, the French government was furious. This new French government was based at the town of Vichy, and Pétain sought to secure his new government. He sought greater powers for his position so he could push through far-reaching reforms. Pétain believed that France had suffered a catastrophic defeat because its people had become weak. Many in France agreed, and Pétain was voted massive emergency powers to basically rewrite the French constitution however he wished. He did three things. He abolished the presidency, he made himself head of the French state with near absolute legal powers, and he dismissed parliament. The new regime, officially called the French state but better known as Vichy France, operated in tandem with the Germans. French volunteers served with the German army, the Vichy regime conducted air raids against Gibraltar, and many Frenchmen went to work in German industry. Many of those who fought with the Germans were simply stringent anti-communists and even held the motto "Better Hitler than Blum." Although please be aware that many of those who served in the factories did this simply out of desperation, and others did it because they were forced to. The Third French Republic was over, at least officially that is. There were those both inside and outside of France who had refused to accept the armistice and wanted to continue the fight against Germany. Inside of France, the French resistance was formed and operated in both occupied and Vichy France. They undertook sabotage, espionage and assassinations to weaken German and Vichy forces. The French resistance wasn't simply one group of people, it's the collective name for various groups. Early on, resistance was mounted by conservative and Catholic groups, but after the German invasion of the USSR in 1941, Stalin authorised communist groups to resist too. Outside of France, Britain and the remnants of the French military which had fled attempted to group these resistance fighters under the umbrella of the French Forces of the Interior, which was to be led by a certain Charles de Gaulle. However, the communists weren't interested in working with the conservative de Gaulle, and many Frenchmen saw him as nothing more than a British puppet and a traitor. This viewpoint changed as the war turned against Germany, whose advance into the Soviet Union had stalled. To make matters worse, the US had joined the war, and along with the rest of the Allies and the Free French were advancing across North Africa. As the Vichy and German forces were pushed back, de Gaulle began to gain legitimacy, and many French soldiers deserted to him and turned against the Vichy government. So de Gaulle had a difficult relationship with the British and the Americans. He was largely left out of decision-making, not treated as an equal, and Roosevelt was also willing to work with Vichy France, whom he saw as more legitimate and potentially more useful. That was until November 1942, when the Germans decided to put an end to Vichy France, and along with the Italians invaded in order to seize the French fleet. Vichy France's last act was to scuttle most of the fleet at Toulon as French sailors held off the German soldiers attempting to seize them. Anyway, the war continued to move in the Allies' favour, and by 1944 the Allies decided to finally invade France. On June the 6th, 1944, better known as D-Day, the Allies landed their forces in Normandy and gained a foothold. In August, the Allies, mostly American and Free French forces, landed in southern France and pushed to here. So de Gaulle would achieve his dream of liberating Paris on the 25th of August 1944. This was done with very little fighting in the city itself, although General Leclerc did engage in heavy fighting south of Paris. A provisional government was set up with de Gaulle as its head, and whilst France most certainly aided with the continued advance into Germany, for many, notably those in the resistance, the war was over. Pétain, incidentally, was taken to Germany and later returned to France, where he was arrested. After Germany's capitulation in 1945, France was given zones of occupation in Germany and Austria, but be aware this was not a sure thing. President Roosevelt and later President Truman believed that since many Frenchmen had fought alongside the Germans, that they were to be treated as a conquered nation. Britain was against this, and in the end the Americans acquiesced, and France was to be treated as a victorious power. In case you're wondering, Britain wasn't doing this to be nice. It simply meant that a rearmed France would be the primary military defender of Western Europe, which was not a position that the Brits wanted. With the war over, de Gaulle now had the difficult job of rebuilding the French government and the country. The French state under Pétain was gone, and so de Gaulle sought to create the Fourth French Republic, which wouldn't suffer from the weaknesses of the Third. Spoiler alert, it did. De Gaulle reinstated the previously elected officials and put Pétain on trial, who was found guilty and given life in prison. By 1946, a new constitution had been approved and elections saw the Communist Party win the most seats, but it was Léon Blum who returned as Prime Minister. France, over the next few years, received immense sums of money from the USA in the Marshall Plan to rebuild and joined the Cold War against the USSR despite the popularity of the Communist Party there. So, France was devastated by the Second World War, and one of the things Charles de Gaulle was hoping to do was to rebuild French prestige in Europe. France joined the UN Security Council as a permanent member, rebuilt its military, and sought to find its new role in the world. Ultimately, World War II's legacy in France is very complicated. France still struggles with determining whether or not Vichy France was legitimate, whether or not surrender was better than fighting to the bitter end, and to what extent the liberation of France was a French one. I hope you enjoyed this episode, and thank you for watching, and a special thanks to Thomas Gestrich, Adam Harvey, Winston Kaywood and James Bisonet. If you'd like to know more about France during the Second World War, there are some book recommendations in the description below.